Hey, what is going on, people? This is Hellbent, and welcome to GUI mini tutorial number 27. This tutorial we're going to be talking about the group box and positioning your controls, specifically the margins and relative position sections, etc. This was actually supposed to be one of the earliest tutorials in this series, but for some reason I forgot that I didn't do it, and eventually I just started assuming that I had done it until about a week or two ago when I was looking through the list of tutorials and I noticed that I hadn't done a tutorial on this in it. So like I said, we're going to be looking at the group box and mostly relative positioning of your controls. If you're not aware of this stuff, it's going to make your life a whole lot easier. Um, and I apologize that I left it off for so long. Anyways, this is probably going to be a two-part series, maybe three parts, probably two parts, but I'll let you guys decide whether or not you want me to do the second part or not. And the way you do that is by rating the video. If the video falls below a certain threshold when it comes time for me to make the next tutorial in this series, I'll look at the percentage of ratings compared to the views, and if it falls below what my expectations are, I won't do the second part. If it's above that, then I will do the second part. So it's up to you if you want a second part or not. Okay, so let's go into the first thing we'll look at is some basic relative positioning, and before we're going to jump to another kind of control before we go to the group box, because the group box has some sizing things that it doesn't make it's not a very good control for the first part of this. So what we're going to do instead is, oh yes, I've already created a basic GUI, so everything on the screen here is just basically creating a little template of a GUI that's going to sit over here in the corner. And what we're going to do is we are going to look at first the margin. Now, how the margin works is as soon as you add your first control, whatever the font type, the font size that you had used for that first control, or like whatever you set the font to. So for example here, if I set it to some other font or some other font size, then the margin of all the controls that follow are going to be based on that font size and type. So let me show you what I mean. So let's go ahead and add a couple of buttons, and I'm going to use buttons because it's very easy to see them. They're going to be this whitish gray color, and they cover everything that they're encompassing. So let's add a couple of buttons. Button, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to position it along the X margin and the Y margin, and I'll give it a width of 100 and a height of let's go 30. And I'll put some text on it because this will come in handy in a little bit. And I'll just duplicate this. I don't know how many I need. Let's see. I'll just use that one there. So what I'm going to do is the first one's going to be at the X margin and the Y margin. The next one is just going to be at the Y margin, so it's going to move over the distance for the X margin beside that first control. And then the last one will set to just the X margin, so it'll drop down to the new line. Okay, I think I have everything here, so let's go ahead and run this. And here we can see what it looks like. To me, it looks like a margin of about 8 to 10 pixels for the height and about 10 to 15 pixels for the width. Now, like I said, the margin is based on the font, and how it works is the height, or the distance between the top of my control based on the Y margin is, let me see, I wrote this down because nobody usually knows this stuff. So the Y-axis is 75% of a normal character, or the height of the font. Okay, so if the font, this doesn't mean how high the actual text that you see is, because if you've ever tried to put controls on top of an image or something like that, actually, you know what, here, this is probably a better way of showing you what I mean. And here, I'll put this way down. Okay, that should be good. Okay, so here I have some text. Now what we yes, okay. What we see here isn't the full extent of what the font size is doing. But if we were to take this and add a border to it, now we can actually see what that font height is. So this height that it used for the Y margin is based on 75% of this height here. Okay, the x-axis is 1.5 times the font. So it is whatever the height of this is. Is it 1.5? No, 1.25. 1.25. So it's this times 1.25 gives us our default x margin. And like I said, it's based on the very first control that we add. So if we were to say change the size of our font of this one here up here to 22, the spacing for our margins is going to change for all the controls that follow it. And even though here I'm not specifying that I'm using the X margin anymore, it's using that spacing for the space in between these controls as well. Also, it's using that Y margin for each time it drops down to a new control below it. Right? So if I keep adding controls, like if I add another control, and if I don't specify X margin or Y margin, what it should do is it should drop the next button pretty much the same way as it made this one here. It should put it right there. Okay? So it's based on the margin for all the rest of the controls are based on that very first control that we add. So what if we want a really big font for the first control, but then after that we don't want to use that same margin anymore? Like we don't want all of our buttons to be this far apart from whatever we have, but we still want to use the automatic spacing that it has. So what we can do is after our first control here, what we can do, or even before that, even like let's say we don't want this to be right there, what we can do is we can manually set what the margin is. So we can come up here and we can say GUI margin and then a comma, and then the first thing that we can add in, the first parameter will be for the X. So let's say if we want the X margin to be 50, we put a 50 there, and then let's say for the Y we want it to be 25. Now if we run this again, we should get a gap of 50 pixels beside it and a gap of 25 pixels above it. And then that should carry over for even the controls that don't have the margin specified in them. Okay, so there we go. So now we can see that it's moved over, and this hasn't changed too much to be super noticeable, so maybe I'll change that to 100 so that way it's super noticeable. Alright, so each time a control is added after that, unless we give it an absolute position, it's going to use those margins. And once again, we can change, after our first control, we can change the margin to whatever we want. So let's say if after that first control we want it to be 10 by 10. And then we get something like that. Okay, so that's the margin and what it's based on. And we'll come back to this a little bit later when I was talking about how this border thing showing the actual size of it, it'll become a little bit more relevant when we get into the group box. Okay, so I think that covers margin and how we can, and you can change the margin size as many times as you want. Okay. You know, one thing I don't deal with, I usually use absolute positioning for most of the time because a lot of the things that I do, I just need a very specific position within it. So what I'm not sure is what happens if I was to just take this, like this might be a thing, I don't know, we'll test it out right here. What if I was to just take margin and not put any parameters? Is it going to reset it back to what based on this font up here? We'll find out. No. Okay, so this apparently does nothing. Okay, good to know. So I'm not exactly sure. See, up here, when it's set when it set the margin the first time when we ran this without us specifying what the margin was, it's using the height of our font to determine what the margin is. And I'm unaware of any variable that holds that value, and I'm unaware of how, if you change it, this is like, I apologize, I just don't know, because I don't deal with this stuff that often. What I'm not sure is how I would actually, if I was to change it like this, how can I get it back to being based on the size? This I don't know. Perhaps if one of you knows, you can leave a comment down below, let other people know. For me, I don't really care, because I don't deal with the margins that much. I usually use absolute positioning, like I said. Okay, so that's that. Let's go on to some relative positioning. Now, for me, for the most part, I just use the only relative positioning is just the X plus whatever. So let's do a couple examples of that. And I'm going to get rid of that. So I'm just going to leave it the default size for the font. And I'm going to put a button there. I'll give it a width and a height of 30. And I'll get rid of this stuff here. Okay, so right now, my impression is that as soon as I run this, it's going to create a button at X10 and Y10. It's going to have a width of 100 and a height of 30. And then underneath it, it's going to use the margin that it's set when I added that first control based on its, once again, it's based on its height. It's going to add another button underneath it in the same x-axis. So if I was to put this at 110, it's going to be still going to be directly underneath it. It's not going to use the X margin, but it will use the Y margin. Whatever the Y margin is, it's going to use that. So it's going to put another button at X10, but the Y margin underneath it. Okay, so we can see here's our Y margin right there. And then it's still at X10. And like I said, if I set this to 110, both buttons will be in that line. Okay. Now, what I usually do is I use the relative positioning where it's going to take, by default, as soon as I added this control, it knows where the last pixel is. So it knows that if it started at 10 and it has a width of 100, that the next pixel over is going to be pixel 111. So if I was to do X plus 10, which means take the last pixel, which is at 110, and add 10 to it. So instead of the button being over here, it's going to be beside it now. So here, I've added 10 pixels, and if I want the next button after that, so once again, as soon as I added this control, it's calculated the last pixel. It knows that it's the starting position plus the width, gives it its final pixel, and if I do, let's say, add 50 to it, it's going to have this button, and then it's going to have a gap of 50 pixels, and then another button. Okay? I can do this same thing with the Y position as well. So let's say that I want to continue on the same x-axis. So I want to use these same values that I've been getting for this to get its starting position. But let's say for this button here, what I want to do is I want to drop it down a bit. So what I can do is I can do Y plus whatever amount. And once again, using this Y plus whatever, as soon as I add that control up there, it knows what the Y position of it was, and it knows how high, how tall it was in pixels. So it knows the very last pixel in that corner. And when I add this next control in, it's going to take that Y position, and I'm going to add 10 to it. So what I should get is a button that's right about here, instead of up there. Okay, so I've taken that position there. I've added 50 to the x-axis, and I've added 10 to the y-axis. Okay, and I can do this over and over for as many controls as I want. Okay, so this is the way that I usually use relative positioning. Occasionally I'll use another way that I'm going to show you right now, which is taking the X and Y position of the start of the control. So when I added this control here, when I added this button here, it knows that this is the starting position. It's X10 and Y10. And what I can do is, let me just start using one button for now. What I can do is I can take that X position and I can add 5 pixels to it. So what I should get now, because I haven't specified the Y axis, what it should do is it should drop down to the next row and it should move over 5 pixels from this position, and our next control will be somewhere about here. So it's only going to be 2 buttons. These 2 buttons are going to be gone. It's just going to be this one underneath it that's going to be right about there. Oh, wait. No, my bad. It's only if I don't specify the X. Like if I was just to do X10, then it'll be dropped down. My bad. So X position plus 5. This time instead what we're going to do is we're going to drop our Y axis. So we're going to take that Y plus 5. So we'll do the same thing we did before, where we dropped it down using the relative position like this, where it takes the last corner there and then drops us down. But we are going to this one's going to be pretty much where it is now, but it's going to be 5 pixels over. Okay, and if I was to actually do this in a loop, we should get a staircase if I have everything right there. Okay, there we go. So we have a little bit of a staircase. So this is taking the starting position, the Y position and X position, and adding to that value rather than where it ended. So it's the beginning rather than the end of it. One of the useful things that I like to do with this is, by default, if I'm not specifying a specific font, or even if I am specifying a specific font type, then or size, what ends up happening is, if I was to do, let's say, and you've probably noticed this before yourself, so this is a good way around the default. This is only going to apply for the default. I mean, you can adjust it to anything you want, but what I'm specifically going to show you is really only about the default. So I'm going to have some text, and I'm just going to say the text, and then what I'm going to do is, beside that, here, I'll make it a little bit more like I usually do. Beside this, I'm going to add an edit box, and I'm just going to position it relative to the end of that text control. So whatever size, once again, it's wherever it ended, I'm going to add to that value to be the beginning of the next one. So I'm going to say X plus 10. I'm not going to change anything with the Y because it's going to be on the same Y axis. And I'm just going to give this a width of 100, and I'll say row 1. So it's going to be 1 row tall. If I run this, you'll notice that if I put a border around the text, you can see that even though this is 1 row and this is 1 row, in fact I'll specify 1 row here, that they don't line up properly. The top of them lines up properly, but the bottom of it doesn't. Now, I don't know about you, but me, this drives me crazy. I hate the way this looks. So if you're just using the default setting, what I can do is I can take the Y position that I have for this text control, and I can change the Y position of the edit box, and the distance that I found to be a pretty good one is YP minus 2. So this one, the edit box control, is going to start 2 pixels higher than this one, and that pretty much evens them out, or close enough that I'm happy with it. So if you look, it's still a little bit off, maybe 3. And this to me is a more appealing to the eye than having the edit box when it's just a single row. Like if I had multiple rows, like 12 rows, then it's not really going to make a difference where if this starts lower or higher or whatever. But when it's only one row, I like my text to be pretty much even, and this is a way that you can do that by taking the Y position that I had for that last control, which was 10, and subtracting 3 from its value. Or 2 from its value is usually what I use, but 3 looks a little bit more center. Okay, so that is that. A few other things that we can do with this is let me set this to be XM and YM, and I'll set this height to be, this is just a little bit of playing around here, and we'll set the width to, let's say, 1. Okay, so we're barely going to be able to see anything when I run this, so we can barely, we see mostly the caret. Everything else is just one little tiny pixel that we can see when it stops flashing or when it's invisible. So what we can do now is we can play around with a few other things, like the width and the height. We can also use that positioning, that Y, the XP, YP. We can do that with the width and height. Now, I've never encountered a time when I've actually needed to do that, but it is something that you can do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a loop. And I'm going to leave the X position the same. I'm not going to change the X position. What I am going to do though is I'm going to take the Y position and I'm going to increase it by the height that I had before, which was 1. And I am going to let's take the width and we will add 1 to its value. And the height we'll just leave at 1. Because in other words, we're going to have to add another variable in. Alright, so if I loop this, let's say 25 times, what we end up is with a triangle. If I loop this 225 times, 555 times. Like I said, not very useful. I don't know why you'd ever want to do this, but it's an option. You can do it. In fact, what we can, here, let's play one more thing. Let's change that to red. Okay, I'm wasting time here. If you're ever going to do something like this, don't use an edit control. There's much better ways of doing this. Okay, so that's that. And in fact, let me think if I can cover anything, if there's anything else that I should cover right now, because I'm going to call it, and then we'll come back to the group box and positioning the controls inside of a group box, which is really going to, if you don't know about it already, is really going to change your life. I think that's it. If before I do the next tutorial, if I end up doing another tutorial, that's up to you guys. If I end up doing the next tutorial on this, I'll try to re-watch this and see where I left off, so that way if I did miss anything that I should have covered in this part of it, I'll make sure to include it in the next part. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. Whether I see you guys on the next one or not is up to you, so be sure to rate this video. Alright, peace.